want to welcome you all to the YouthBuild AmeriCorps Match webinar live from Somerville, Massachusetts. The date is April 11th, 2019 for those who are listening after the fact. Just taking some time to introduce ourselves here. For those of you that have not met us, my name's Michael Stopa. I'm a financial grants manager here at YouthBuild USA, and I work with some of you.
This is Johnny, financial manager here at YouthBuild USA.
This is Brookside Mangesha. I'm also the financial manager.
And you can see our phone numbers and emails here for those of you that may not have them. And as well, the AmeriCorps FSR at youthbuild.org, that's our general team email. They go into a pool that we all have access to. If you are unsure of who to contact, you can always use that. You're always free to call or email your FM if you have any questions about anything. Just an overview of what we'll be going over. First, Brookside will be going over a general match overview. Johnny will be speaking a little bit about tracking match, and I myself will be going over some best practices when it comes to match. We're going to be saying the word RAD a lot, and for those of you that don't know, RAD means reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. And these are the standards that we hold all expense and match to your AmeriCorps grant. Basically, all expenses and match items billed to your grant have to meet these four requirements. So if you hear us say RAD, we're really saying reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. We're also going to be talking about your ARR. Your ARR is AmeriCorps reimbursement request that you send to us every month. The two parts that we're probably going to mention quite a bit are your FSR, which you can see a picture of there, and your expense and match workbook, which you can see a picture to the right of the FSR. We may say these words, and just be sure if you're unclear of what we're saying, these are the documents we are referring to. I'm going to hand things over to Brookside, and she's going to talk about match for you guys.
Your program cost included in your approved AmeriCorps budget is made up of CNCS share and grantee share. When we say CNCS share, it's the portion of the budget or the program cost paid for with CNCS funds. On the other hand, grantee share is the portion of the budget that's not paid for with CNCS funds. We refer to grantee share as match, recipient share, or sub-grantee share. So you will hear us using either of these words referring to match. Your AmeriCorps grant is a combination of 50% AmeriCorps funds and 50% match. This is a 50% match your program brings to the table that would help you achieve your program's objectives. So in order to utilize your AmeriCorps fund, you have to meet this 50% matching requirement. So let's look at as an example. If your AmeriCorps total grant award is $50,000, your CNCS AmeriCorps operating fund will be $25,000 and your match will be $25,000. In other words, when your program receives $25,000 AmeriCorps operating funds, you are required to provide dollar-to-dollar match in the amount of $25,000. Match could be cash or in-kind. In this webinar, we will look at both of these sources of matches. So let's first look at cash. Cash match source are payments you receive in the form of cash, check. It could be electronic payment or donations. Your cash match sources could be from a foundation grant. It could be sales of goods and other income-generating activities. It could be corporation contributions, and also public, such as state appropriation. When you are considering using public funding as a match source, you have to consider the following. As most of you know, as of July 16, 2018, federal funds are not allowed to be used as a match source. So if you are considering using any public awards as a match, make sure it isn't a pass-through federal grant. So if you ever have any question or doubt about this, you can always reach out to your grantor. Now let's look at in-kind source of match. So in-kind contributions are non-cash contributions in the form of goods or services. So this kind of donations are donations that you can put value to and it's used in achieving your program's objective. Here we have some examples: training, equipment. It could be in the form of property or space. It could be different services that support your program, or specific as getting a vehicle from a donor. So let's look at as an example. If your local partner donates funds to your organization that help offset the cost of a CPR training towards your members, this could be used as cash match source. On the other hand, if the local partner is donating the expertise of one of its employees to provide CPR training to your members instead of donating funds, this could be an in-kind donation. So this is the difference between cash and in-kind. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this section. It's the source of match section you find in your expense and match worksheet. This is something we review at the beginning of your budget creation, and we continually review it throughout your expenditure period. To just quickly go over it, the first column asks for your source of match. This is basically asking you the name of your funder. So if it is in-kind or cash, you just need to let us know who the funder is. The next column asks for whether it's a cash or in-kind, so you just need to describe that. And the purpose section is just to describe what that match will be covered using one of these source matches. So let's look at RAD now. As we have said repeatedly, a match is treated the same way we treat expense. Your match sources and your match expenses have to be reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. So costs incurred as match for the program's operation have the same restrictions and regulations as costs that will be reimbursed through your AmeriCorps grant. Next, we will go over how to keep your match RAD, how to document and track match sources so that you are able to mitigate risk and maximize the impact of the AmeriCorps grant. Let's start by looking at reasonable. So cost is reasonable if it's meeting the following general criteria. It has to pass the prudent person test. It has to be ordinary and necessary to achieve your overall objective of your organization. It also shouldn't significantly deviate from the organization's established practices. When looking at a donation, it could be either in-kind or cash match source, you can ask the following questions to help you determine whether the match is reasonable. Would you have purchased this good or service if it wasn't donated? Does the donation pass the prudent person test? If not, is there a comparable item you can use? To go back to the example I gave earlier about getting an expertise to train CPR for your members as an in-kind source of match, that is something that's reasonable. You can ask this question, is it something I could have paid for if it wasn't donated? The answer is yes. Does it pass the prudent person test? The answer is also yes. But instead of that, let's say your local funder gave you a 3D printer. That is something you will have a hard time justifying if it is something you will purchase if it wasn't donated, or whether or not it would pass the prudent person test. Now let's look at allowable. So when we say allowable, it has to abide by the Office of Management and Budget Cost Principles, and it needs to also be part of your approved budget at the beginning of your grant creation. There are expressly unallowable costs such as alcohol, entertainment, fines, fundraising, providing food for service events, and gift cards. So this is not unique to match. This is the same unallowable costs to the AmeriCorps grant. So just to let you know that this also applies to match. So now let's look at allocable. If you purchase an item or get a match that benefits only AmeriCorps, then it has to be billed directly to AmeriCorps. However, if you receive a match that benefits not only AmeriCorps but other departments within your program, then it needs to be equitably allocated. That is to say, for instance, if you are receiving an in-kind match in the form of space, but more than just AmeriCorps members, there are other programs who are using that space, then you need to have an allocation plan to properly allocate the costs. If you go to your Dropbox folder, there is helpful forms folder we keep. In that folder, there is a sample cost allocation plan. You can use that, or you can reach out to us if you have any specific questions. So the last part of RAD is documented. So for both cash and in-kind match sources, you have to keep proper documentation. It has to be part of the approved budget, and as well as maintaining monthly tracking of match in your general ledger. Johnny will go over how to track your match in detail.
We have two questions in the chat box. The first one, what document what kind of document is needed to support some sort of space that's been donated to the program?
Yeah, so it gets a little tricky here just because different states have different requirements on how land and buildings are valued, but you'd need some sort of official legal valuation of the space that's being donated to you, whether that is a actual legal process done by the state, or going down to City Hall and getting the actual property value if it's a full property, or it could just be if it's a space that is normally occupied by someone else, the value that the landlord values it at normally for rent. It's really going to depend on the type of space, and there's no real clear answer, but you just need some sort of official evaluation of the space along with a few other requirements such as an in-kind donation form and any other official correspondence with the donor that you might have.
Yeah, you can reach out to us directly, and we'll work through it.
Crystal added in that DOL requires an independent appraisal in order to count as in-kind space. I believe that is the case for AmeriCorps as well.
Yep.
Like I said, you need some sort of official legal appraisal of the value of the space so that there is some sort of price officially documented for what's being given to you.
Okay.
So Rocio is also asking if incentives from assuming members can be used as match. No incentives. So recognition costs, including like certificates or graduation diplomas from your program, can be included, but no actual incentives for things like meeting thresholds for monthly service hours or anything like that can be included as match. What if you own the building? Will this be allowable as match? So yeah, if you own the building, you can't use it as match because it's your building. It's not something you're getting. You're not getting income from it. It's not being donated to you. It's already a space you own. So it can't be used as match. The one part that could potentially be used in this situation is if you sublet part of your building or if you get rent income from part of your building. The income you make on that space can be used just because it can be used as a general match source, a general funding source for your match.
So now that we talked about RAD and defined match, let's go over how to track, document, and value this match. So in this section, we'll be briefly going over the IG audit, tracking match, allocating match, and then finally how to value and document match in-kind donations. So let's start with the audit. In 2017, we went through a big audit. The IG auditors visited YouthBuild USA and 3 sub-grantee programs. That year, we noticed quite a bit of attention on our match tracking process. And in 2005, the auditors found $6.5 million in question costs. And as you can see here, it was mostly match. So this ultimately led to a more robust match tracking process. And for those of you who've been with us for a few years, you probably noticed that we've been focusing on match as of late. And again, it's a reaction to these findings. The key takeaway from this process has been that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. It's very important to keep this in mind. So a written policy is a solid foundation to work off of when you start reporting, documenting, and tracking match. This means a clear process that lays out how you allocate and track your match. And this might be the first thing the auditors check when they come to your site. So let's quickly go over some scenarios of both findings and their consequences. In scenario 1, let's assume that auditors find that costs don't appear in the approved budget. So the consequence of this would be the disallowance of federal funds because match is not met, so you don't meet that 50% threshold. So you might have the documentation, but it's not in your budget, and that's a problem. It must be in your budget. So in scenario 2, let's assume the auditors find no supporting documentation such as timesheets or payroll. So your cost might be in your approved budget, but nothing else has been submitted. So the consequence of this would be that you enter into something that is called the audit resolution, which requires significant time and effort to confirm all match. This is when the auditor checks everything. This increase of scope always runs the risk of the auditor finding other disallowed or undocumented items. So to mitigate the risk of any of this happening, you should be documenting everything. And again, a written policy would be a great place to start. So I want to do a quick survey. Do you track match on a monthly basis? It looks like most of you answered yes. So I want to emphasize and remind everyone that match is treated like expense. Same standards, same everything. Except that you don't submit match documentation or backup documentation on a monthly basis. We have to track match on a monthly basis, just like expense. You submit your match report. However, you do not submit that backup documentation on a monthly basis, just that match report. This doesn't mean we're not asking for match documentation at all. We're asking programs to submit your first month of substantial match and last month of match for review. We'll be reaching out to you directly about this. We're treating it as case by case since all of our programs operate on different schedules. This match review process will give us some sort of sense of how you track match. But a couple things to keep in mind is that you can build a strong policy. You can separate the match GL for each grant year. And then lastly, you can make sure that the GL ties penny for penny. So I'm going to move on to allocating match. We've seen many methods on how programs allocate match, but a few good ways that some programs have allocated match appropriately are that they've assigned costs during the budget process, they provided a cost allocation plan, and they have some sort of Excel spreadsheet tracker tool. I want to go over a few scenarios. On the screen we have 3 allocation policies. We have a weak policy, an average policy, and a strong policy. So a weak allocation policy would be that expenses are simply allocated based on what funds are available. There's no written method, therefore an auditor can come in and question all costs. An average policy would be that a program has some sort of established process. They have a cost allocation spreadsheet that splits out the fair share of expenses across multiple funders. The only thing missing is the method is not written. There's no consistency, therefore an auditor can go in and start questioning costs. And a strong allocation policy would be a program has a written policy, a clear process written down. They have also a cost allocation plan. And the policy has costs that are incurred specifically for the award in a clear way. And finally, it's split fairly between grants. So if an expense provides a benefit to another project like DOL, then the cost should be fairly split between AmeriCorps and DOL. Finally, I want to talk about documenting and valuing in-kind match. It's fairly simple. When you're ready to value an in-kind donation, you should immediately start thinking about using the fair market price, which essentially means whatever a reasonable person would pay for in the market. This is assuming that both you and the person or organization donating the asset have a reasonable understanding of the value. The IRS defines fair market price value as the price that the item would sell for on the open market. You should also be considering what it would cost to obtain similar goods and services. In order to find the reasonable market price, you should be looking at 2 or maybe 3 options to really determine a benchmark on the value of the donation. For example, if someone provides a type of consulting service or case management or administrative service, you should have an idea of what the services typically run for. This will help avoid any valuing that would appear as excessive or unreasonable. Another thing required is that the donor must provide the value of the donation. You and your organization should not be the ones who are determining the value of the donated goods or services. So you must get this information before you submit anything. And finally, you have to review the donation letter or form to ensure that the value is reasonable. We're giving you the benefit of the doubt that you're practicing RAD at all times. So how do you document all of this? So first off, you should have a clear calculation for how you determine the value. For example, you have a consultant or someone providing case management. Some questions you should be asking yourself would be like, what is their time worth? Is it based on a certain number of hours? Another example that has come up is office space. To determine that, you would most likely look at the lease, perhaps determining based on square footage being used by the AmeriCorps program. Again, remember that if you're audited, a grantee may be required to provide documentation of all of this, so please be very clear about it. So once you're done with that, you put all this information on paper, so it needs to be written and documented by the donor. This is typically handled by the in-kind contribution form that captures all key information. So Brute mentioned this earlier in the webinar, and it looks like this. Pretty straightforward. Once you complete this, you can submit that to us. And finally, again, you must enter it into your GL as income and expenditure. Do we have any questions in the chat box?
We have one question so far. Can we do a budget modification to change match from the original approved match source? So you can. This is, I imagine, something that's going to become more and more common now that DOL is no longer an allowable match source. You're probably making your budget in the summer, which could be months, almost half a year before you guys actually start your program year. And we know that financial situations change. You may have gotten a new grant that is better suited to be used as match versus the original match sources you thought you would be using. In those situations, yes, you can do a budget mod. You can do it the same way that you would do any other budget mod. You'd just be simply changing the match side of the grant rather than the expense side. and then listing any new match sources you have. So I'm going to go over some best practices, but I think this is a good time to just give a little reminder of why we do this work. Everything we do at YouthBuild, and this includes those of you in financial offices, is to ensure that the young people, the members and populations you serve, have the best YouthBuild and best AmeriCorps experience possible. I think it's important to recognize this just because I think as financial managers and working in the financial offices, it can be easy to become divorced from the actual impact of the work you're doing. But rest assured, the financial management of your grant is just as important as program design and implementation in the regard of maximizing the impact you can have on the young people you're serving. And following these best practices and the things that we're training you on today will help ensure that your young people have the best AmeriCorps and YouthBuild experience possible. So with that, we're going to talk about some of the things that CNCS requires. These are hard, fast requirements that CNCS has. First, they require match and expense documentation to be maintained at an equal standard, equal being the prominent word there. They require consistent application of expenditure policies all over all organizational activities. They require all in-kind donations to be entered into your GL, as Johnny said. And they require all accounting and match funds meet GAAP standards. For those of you that may not know, GAAP simply stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. I'm going to go into depth about those first three. The last one, we're going to kind of leave it up to you to make sure that you're meeting all accounting principle standards. But those first three we can kind of go into a little depth about. So let's talk about documentation and how it relates to your match. So like I said before, your match documentation policy should be identical to your expense documentation policy. There's no exceptions here. It needs to be identical. This also means that your match file keeping policy should be identical to your expense file keeping policy. And what does this mean? As you may or may not be aware, you're required to keep monthly physical records of all months you bill to each grant year for 3 years after the close of the grant. This is 3 years after the close of the full 3-year grant cycle, not just each individual grant year. And as well as that, it is the close of the 3-year grant cycle as far as YouthBuild USA is concerned, not your individual program. So this is a date we can always provide you with, but you will be required to keep documentation on hand for quite some time, as many as 6 years after you close out a grant, possibly for that first year in the 3-year grant cycle. So this obviously includes all in-kind donations, and one thing I want to make sure that you're aware of and that we all are on the same page about is that in-kind donations are often held under higher scrutiny. Because they are a little more wishy-washy, valuation isn't necessarily the same as a cash gift, they're harder to track. Auditors often look at these extremely closely. And this means that you should keep extra care when maintaining documentation for them. All forms of documentation required to any in-kind donation should be kept. This goes beyond just the in-kind donation form that Johnny showed you, the documentation related to valuation. I would actually go further and keep all written correspondence with the donor on file as well. This means email chains, possibly written notes from in-person meetings if those are important or they happened. Again, like Johnny said, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. And because in-kind donations are held under such high scrutiny, it's important to make sure that you keep all of that as much as possible. So let's talk about policies, right? We can't really tell you how to make your policies because your policies are going to be specific to your individual programs, right? But we can give you some guidelines on how to follow, what to do and how to follow your monthly policies. So I think the most important thing, as Johnny said, is just to keep your monthly financial policies and procedures written down and up to date at all times. You want to keep them written down because if they're in writing, then you can hand that written policy list to an auditor or to anyone else that's looking at your files, and they'll understand what you guys did to get there. We provide you a fiscal checklist in your expense and match workbook, and I think it's important to follow that fiscal checklist for both expense and match every month. The checklist is designed that if you prepare your monthly reimbursements to us using it, you will not have any issues. All portions of your ARR, expense and match, will be met, and there won't be any issues going forward. And I think it's important to train any new staff on your written fiscal policies as well as our provided fiscal checklist. to ensure that they're being followed at all times. Training new staff can often be difficult, and having written and clear policies prevents any issues that could be related to onboarding, any hiccups that could happen when staff leave and new staff come on. So always have those policies written and follow them at all times. And finally, I'm going to talk about in-kind donations in the general ledger. Again, we can't exactly tell you how to do this because most of you are using different softwares. In-kind donations need to be entered into the GL as both a credit and a debit. It should hit an in-kind expense account as a debit and an in-kind income account as a credit. And it should be separated into all forms of in-kind contributions that you have. Basically, you need separate in-kind contribution accounts for labor, supplies, services, any sort of in-kind donations that you're getting. That's what CNCS requires. Now, let's talk about what CNCS, as in their own language, strongly recommends. They strongly recommend that all AmeriCorps match funds be entered into the general ledger and that these funds be easily distinguishable from non-AmeriCorps funds. This takes me to another quick poll, and I just want to ask, do you currently track match within your GL? So it seems like about 3/4 of you guys are tracking match within your GL, and another quarter of you aren't. And given that it's a strong recommendation from CNCS, that might leave you a little worried. We'll talk about what you guys can do in a little bit. But first, let's go over the folks of you that are tracking match in your general ledger. Obviously, it must adhere by generally accepted accounting principles. It must be easily distinguishable between funds not used as match. What you do is going to depend greatly on how your program's structured and the software you're using, so we can't give you exact answers on how to put match into your GL. But here are some possible ways you can do it. You can have a separate accounts where all match sit with unique account codes, basically having double expense accounts, one of which is used for match, one of which is not used as match. You can use a pass-through account for funds to hit before they sit in their normal expense account. Or you can have a memo or note line that allow written notice for that funds are used as match. The kind of general rule of thumb is that at any time you should be able to pull a list of all of the expenses being used as match from your GL at any time. And they should be easily distinguishable between different grants that you're matching, as in you should be able to pull a GL of your AmeriCorps match funds separate from your DOL match funds, and you should be able to pull them all at the same time, see all the funds you're using as match between all grants. You should just be able to pull any information related to your match from your GL at any time. So some of you might be sitting there and saying, oh man, I can't currently do that. Our systems aren't set up to do that. What am I going to do? You might look a lot like this dog on the skateboard. He doesn't belong on that skateboard. Nobody knows what's going on. And for that we say keep calm and don't panic. Because CNCS does have your back in this situation. Not all AmeriCorps programs are the same, and they recognize that there may be special situations of programs that are simply unable to do match within their GL. And it's really a two-step process here. So the first is a written policy on how match is tracked and maintained outside of the GL. Again, always important to have your written policies. And then separately, a spreadsheet that clearly and simply tracks match income and expense. You just want to have a document that's going to basically do the same thing that your GL is doing, just that exists outside of your GL. So let's talk about what this Excel spreadsheet might look like. A couple key points that you have to follow. All grants requiring match should be tracked within the same document. You don't want to have separate documents tracking separate grants for match. You want to have one match master spreadsheet. It should be sortable, as in you can sort it by any and all distinguishing factors, such as the grant you're matching, the grant that is being used to match, amounts, dates, etc. It should be simple and easy to follow for anyone looking at it. And what this basically means is that if somebody came in and had an understanding of grants management and sat down and looked at your spreadsheet that you're using to track match, they should be able to understand it within reason. It shouldn't be so obtuse that you have to explain it in detail to someone for them to see what's going on. Additional to that, you should have clear written guidelines on how the workbook was created, how it is maintained, and how it should be viewed. And it should be designed with an audit in mind. Basically, you want to design this in a way that you can be handed to an auditor and they won't have any questions or they won't be confused at all, because as you know in financial offices, the more questions an auditor has, the harder they're going to look at something and the more likely they're going to find issues or issues might arise. Finally, it should refer to the GL where able to. And basically what this means is any accounts that it's hitting, that those expense lines are hitting in your GL, dates, transaction numbers, any identifying numbers that your GL may create upon expenses being entered into it. They should be referenced in your spreadsheet. Basically anything that can tie it to the GL in any meaningful way should be included. So let's go over the 3 important takeaways. You want to create a policy that easily distinguishes between your match and non-match funds, whether that's putting match into your GL, using a spreadsheet outside of your GL. You want to write down your policy in a clear, concise, and easy to follow fashion. And you have to, and I emphasize, always stick to your policy for all forms of match, for all grants, for all grant years. We want to thank you for joining us. Again, this is our information for your FM, whether it's myself, Brute or Johnny. You can reach us at these emails and these phone numbers, or you can reach us at the general AmeriCorps FSR at youthbuild.org. Again, if you have any questions at any time about your match process, tracking your match monthly, reporting match to us, or match in general, you can ask us at any time. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you guys have a fantastic day.